Morning. My name is Pavani, and this is my husband Vajra, and we'll both be sharing this morning. The title of the reading today, Ego, Friend or Foe, I find intriguing. Excuse me. Wrong white binder. I think most of us experience the ego more as a foe than a friend. So I thought I'd begin by sharing an example of ego as friend. This is a reading from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam that Yogananda wrote commentaries on and Kriyananda edited. And this is a paraphrase from one of the quatrains. By what presumption were we hurried down to earth? No one consulted us. And from what unknown regions were we summarily expelled? To what distant spheres, our permission still not asked, are we all rushed off again? Oh, another and another cup of heaven's wine, in ecstasy, intuitionally inspired, let me wake from this insulting imposition. By what hypnosis was I persuaded to be the helpless tool of destiny? No longer will I be tossed, terror-stricken, back and forth between the courts of life and death, ignorant of the whys and wherefores of my existence. So, this is what propels us to the spiritual path. It takes a strong sense of self to have the confidence to separate from the norm and consciously come onto the path. And then when we come onto the path, we learn that that ego consciousness is the cause of all of our suffering. Why? Because we define ourselves by everything that won't last. Our bodies, our personality, our family, our abilities, etc. And in that self-identity, we experience ourselves as separate and as alone. And in that separateness and aloneness, often we feel fear and anxiety. I've been talking with friends recently, and there seems to be a theme running right now, also in my own life, of recognizing how much undercurrent anxiety one can feel. And it's like static in the background. And, you know, you look around and there's just always trouble. If it's not in your own life, it's in lives of friends that you know, and certainly in the world. And because there's always troubles, there's always this opportunity to be anxious and upset, right? Yeah. So you begin to think, So if our nature is bliss and peace, and there's the way the world is set up, there's always this opportunity to be anxious and upset. Maybe the idea is not to be anxious about any of it. But how do we do that? You know, when we get besieged by emotion and those whirlpools within us, we can't just will ourselves out of it. There's a story of a woman at Ananda who was suddenly besieged by panic attacks. And they were so severe, she went to the doctor, who told her that he could treat her with medication, but that she would have to stay on medication for the rest of her life. And she didn't want to do that. And so at home, amidst another panic attack, she suddenly remembered a story that Swami had told, when he was in a very busy period of his life, and his secretary at the time decided to quit and leave him hanging. And he was upset about it. But he couldn't let it go. And he sat in meditation, and he thought, well, if I can't let this go, I'll accept it. So he went into that feeling and just completely accepted it, and then took that energy and brought it up to the spiritual eye and offered it up. And it went away. So this woman, in the midst of a panic attack, decided to try this. So it took all her concentration and energy, but she accepted it, she brought it up, offered it, and it went away. And a few minutes later, another attack came, but this one was worse than ever. So she did it again, and it took 3 tries, 3 times of doing this process, and it went away. And she never had trouble with it again. So, thinking about this idea of offering it up, I've been experimenting with what I call vertical living. So, how do we maintain a state of consciousness where we can relate to the world and to ourselves with a sense of peace and even increasing joy? And, we have so many tools. Of course, meditation is the foundation, energization, music is helpful. But what I've been experimenting with is things to practice in the moments of daily life when things are happening. And the first one is God remembrance, which we all know about. But really focusing on keeping my awareness up and focused on one of the masters or Swamiji or Divine Mother, it could be whoever you feel attuned to. And especially when I feel my energy getting pulled out and embroiled or pulled down into a whirlpool, just shifting my awareness up and onto that image. And what I find is that when I'm able to do it, I'm able to respond rather than react to a situation. And because I'm more relaxed, and I'm able to step back just a little bit. The other thing I've been experimenting with, and I find this especially intriguing, is, one of the things that I know I get agitated about, and I think most people can relate, is there's so many things in our lives that are undone. We have those lists. And that's a lot of the underlying anxiety. I haven't done this, I should have done that, I need to be different, this situation needs to be different. You know all the things that we do. And so just to practice seeing everything, even that list of undone things, as part of Divine Mother's plan. Somehow, that's her timing. And the mind can think, well, you're just letting yourself off the hook. But again, when I'm able to practice this, what I find is that it makes life more interesting. And I actually, because I'm relaxed, I have more energy to actually meet those things. And it makes me think, okay, Divine Mother, what are you doing here? What are you up to? Why have you done it this way? And it becomes more fun. I'd like to close with a story that a woman named Peggy Dietz tells about Master and Rajasi. And Peggy Dietz was a very close disciple of Yogananda. She was his chauffeur. And she tells of going into a room where Master and Rajasi were. He was the foremost male disciple of Yogananda. And they were having a meal. And Master was laughing, and he was pointing to the ceiling. And on the ceiling, there was this circle of water, this spot of water. And he explained that he had snuck a water pistol into the room, and at a certain point had distracted Rajasi by saying, look, look, the bird out the window. Shot the water pistol up so that the water would drip down on Rajasi's bald head. and Rajasi, actually it was a good example. He was very calm, he didn't react, he didn't know why that had happened. And a few minutes later, Master repeated this process, shot the water, and this time Rajasi figured it out, and they had quite a hearty laugh. And I was thinking that's such a fun image of, Master or Divine Mother with their water pistols. And they're shooting water up on the ceiling of our earthly existence. And it's coming down on our heads, and sometimes it feels kind of irritating. And we can't see that it's them over there, but that in the end, we too will have a hearty laugh with them. God bless you.
I'd like to start with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. It's the demand not to be enslaved by the ego or by ego-centered passivity. I want to use my own will, but guide it ever, Father, toward the golden paradise of all fulfillment. For I would be infinity's smiling child, confident of being imprisoned no longer behind bars of fruitless desire and withered hopes. I would break the shameful cords of lethargy that have presumed to hold me and step fearlessly into freedom. Realized, I now blaze my way through forests of every limitation and delusion. Oh, my little vain ego may strut proudly, saying, "Behold my glory, worship me." But I will look through its transparent form and behold thine unimaginable beauty, clothed in the subtle form of the whole universe. The silence-tuned hearing of my soul will ignore that tiny, boasting masquerader, my little self impersonating thee, and will listen rapturously to the wind-borne, fragrant music of thine own matchless voice, whispering across the ages, I am he. Remember Gary McSweeney standing up in front of a group giving a service or a talk of some sort and saying, I don't actually need this podium, but it does give me something to duck behind. I wanted to talk about stained glass windows. Each of us is a stained glass window through which the glory of God is manifested in all of its diversity and all of its wonder. I remember as a child going to Gloria Dei Lutheran Church, and it was a newly built church, and they had completed construction and were holding services, but not all of the stained glass windows had been completed, so some of them were just squares of colored light. And every once in a while, a new window would appear with all of its intricacy and all of its detail and all of its color and all of its wonder as the sunlight shone through it. Master, during World War II, wanted to build a church, and because of the war, there were shortages everywhere and restrictions on everything. You couldn't build. So he found an old, dilapidated building. He had a lot, but there was no structure on it, and he couldn't build. But he was able to take that old, dilapidated building and have it lifted up and put on wheels and moved, much to the dismay of his neighbors, to that spot. And they rebuilt it. And it was beautiful, but it didn't have stained glass windows. And he said, we've got to have stained glass windows in this beautiful church. And they said, you can't get stained glass windows with all the shortages and that. They're not available. He said, oh, we'll find them. And Divine Mother showed him where to find them, revealed to him in a dream that there were some very nice stained glass windows in a local junkyard. Well, he went there, and the proprietor said, no, we don't have any stained glass windows. And Master said, well, do you mind if I look out back? And I don't care what you do. And he went out back, and there was the helper out there. And so he asked the helper, he said, do you have any stained glass windows out here? And the helper said, boss say no, must be no. Would you mind coming over here with me into this corner of the lot? Boss say no, must be no. Okay, just come with me if you would. You see these boards there? Would you just move those boards? Boss say no, must be no. We don't got no stained glass windows. Just move the boards if you would. And they moved the boards, and sure enough, there they were, the stained glass windows. Brought them over to the church, cleaned them up. The metaphor is often given of once you remove the mud of the ego from the stained glass window, then the light of God shines through in all its beauty. I used to wonder at, speaking of personalities and the curious mixes that we come up, why it was that all the great mechanics that I knew were as cantankerous as all get out. And it seemed to be, I knew quite a number of them, and it was the same with all of them. You had to walk on eggshells talking with them to get them to fix your car. But if you could get past that, and heaven help you if you drove in with a car that they didn't like, you might as well just keep on driving. You were going to get nowhere with them. But once you got past that, they had the ability to pop the hood and say, oh, what's this down here? Is this the problem? And go right to it and find out what it is. Well, that curious mix of personalities, the different lights, the different nuances, it's also true of saints. And it's also true of highly developed souls on the spiritual path. Sometimes a highly developed soul will have major character flaws, and it's a very strange seeming thing. Swami described it this way. Well, as the light that shines through a stained glass window is stronger, it brightens everything, it illuminates everything, it brings to the fore. So you can get somebody who's a highly developed soul who has very peculiar characteristics, and they're more intensified because the energy is stronger that is coming through them. Now, I don't know if it was a character or flaw or not, but there was a saint in India who used to throw rocks at his disciples. If it was for their spiritual good or who knows what it was. Swami Kriyananda was thrown out of SRF, and there were court battles, there was all this thing, and the question came up, how is it possible for great souls serving the same master to be so at odds, to be in such a position of contention? Well, we don't really know the answer to that. But we are told, I mean, Jesus said it, your ways are not my ways. The yardsticks that we use to evaluate things aren't necessarily the ones that apply. The reason for things happening isn't necessarily information that we are privy to. The information is unavailable to the mortal man, quote Simon and Garfunkel. Arjuna refused to fight at Kurukshetra because he didn't want to be slaughtering his relatives, his close friends. And Krishna told him, this is your karma, you have to do this. This is your dharma. This is what you were born for. You see bodies fall. I see souls rise. So the way we look at things is not necessarily the whole picture. The Bhagavad Gita says, knowing the play of visible things within the world of sense and how the qualities must qualify. The light comes through in many different forms. It's the nature of this world to qualify the light. And so it is with us. We are each of us a particular qualification. So we're trying to clean that stained glass window. We're trying to work with that process. And if we can't understand it, well, then how exactly do we work with it? Swami said this: one can be happy or one can be dour. No one, however, manifests his actual God-given nature until he has rid himself of those ego limitations developed by constantly revising his own self-definitions, until he learns to allow the divine light to shine through him clearly. That's when the beauty of the stained glass is revealed. When we stop distracting ourselves, when we stop limiting ourselves. We are constantly limiting ourselves by our own self-imposed self-definitions. This is who I am. I don't do that. I like this. I don't like that. This makes me happy. This makes me angry. These are all externally imposed or internally imposed, but not from God. They're from our habits. They're from our karma. They're from our reactions to the world around us. We talk ourselves into it. Well, if you want a self-definition, try this one. I am a child of God. Don't make it complicated. Leave it at that. What comes of itself, let it come. Be aware of your own reality. Be aware of that presence within you. When a pundit came to Yogananda with questions and sat down and posed his first very intellectual, very involved question, Yogananda replied in answer, love God. The pundit, thinking that, well, perhaps he didn't quite understand, let me try to ask a little simpler question, posed another intellectual question, and then Yogananda again replied, love God. After a third question, Yogananda stood up, put his hands on the desk, leaned over to him and said, love God, and ended the interview. I don't know whether that pundit ever got it or not, but it's the same message for all of us, really. All that stuff that we worry about, that we fret about, love God. That's first and foremost. For me, a lot of that means just opening myself to feeling God's presence, allowing it to come. Whatever way it comes, just feeling it. Use the techniques, heavens. They've been given to us for a reason. Yogananda said, if you practice 1/10 of what I've given you, it'll get you to God. Pray, energize, chant, meditate, seek out satsang. Thank you for joining us here today. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. When we come together, we create a magnetism that lifts our own each of us lifts our spiritual consciousness in a way that we can't do on our own. Babaji, Krishna Babaji. For those who don't know, in our lineage, Krishna was an earlier incarnation of Babaji. So we talk of Babaji Krishna. Even a little practice of this inward religion will free you from dire fears and colossal suffering, the anxiety that Pavani was talking about. These are techniques that will help you. You don't, even if you're not thinking about them, no matter what, just do them. Just do them, and they will help you to let go of those dire fears and colossal sufferings and experience what's already there. Being non-judgmental. Whether what's coming through are flaws or qualities. Swami once at a spiritual renewal week was illustrating this point and talking about a disciple of Masters, an advanced disciple of Masters, and he started to talk about some personal quirks that he had, some character flaws that he had, and he stopped in midstream and said, I feel the Master isn't pleased with me. He was a great disciple. He loved Master. I shouldn't be talking about him in this way. Don't be judgmental. Don't engage in saying negative things about people, about gossiping. We all get pulled into that. Don't say anything unkind. Just stop and think before you speak. Is that something unkind? Should I be saying that? And the same holds true of ourselves. Who are we the hardest on ourselves? Who are we the most judgmental about ourselves? We are children of God. Give ourselves that grace. Allow ourselves to express in that way. Swami later in his life just felt joy on practicing the presence of God, Brother Lawrence's prescription. Practice the presence of God in everything you do. Swami, as he went along in his life, he got to the point where he just felt joy all the time. He was constantly in the presence of God. Early on, he made the determination not to let anything rob him of his peace. And that was the beginning of that. If there was something that he could see that's going to upset me, he wouldn't go there. He wasn't going to let anything take that presence away from him, and that determination helped him get to the point where all he experienced was God's presence. Happiness, anxiety, these are choices that we make along the way. Do we want to be happy? Do we want to be They're actually choices. We're not required to do either. Our nature is to experience joy. Swami got to the point where he could feel he didn't know where Swami Kriyananda left off and Yogananda began. It just was a continuum. And so it is. Yogananda said he had no disciples. They were disciples of God. That's because there was no boundaries between he and God, between him and God. And finally, Swami began to recognize with everyone he saw that they want the same thing I want. All they really want, no matter how they were expressing it, all their soul really wants is to know God. It's the same as what I want. And in that recognition, he felt such kinship, such compassion, such an opening of God's love that it would sometimes bring him to tears. Jesus taught that the more we can empty ourselves and become as nothing before the Lord. Remember that beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, which really means blessed are the inwardly free. Those who are completely without ego, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The more we can empty ourselves and become as nothing before the Lord, the more perfectly we discover our entire existence in God. And Krishna taught that the more we can separate ourselves from ego involvement, the more perfectly we find ourselves immersed in God's love and God's joy. So why do we try so hard to make it so difficult? Pray for God's presence within. Try to feel that presence within. Open your heart. Allow it to flow through and share it with all.